We claim that our one and only Unitarian Universalist miracle happened on September 30th, 1770. A few years earlier, English preacher John Murray and his wife Eliza had been members of a revivalist church in London. There, they were asked to rescue a young woman who had left to become a Universalist. Rather than following Calvinist doctrine that an elect minority of souls were already saved and only they would go to heaven, the woman had come to believe that all souls would reach heaven. In other words, she believed in universal salvation, or Universalism for short. So to try to better understand what they needed to do to win this young woman back, the Murrays read books on Universalism, and they listened to Universalist sermons, and they studied what others had written. Well, soon enough, Eliza was convinced that Universalism was right. And then John was convinced. And when John began preaching Universalism, then it wasn't long before the Murrays were made to leave the revivalist church. This wasn't the first time that John had been turned away from a church, but soon that was the least of his problems. His only son died in infancy, and then Eliza died. John had gone into debt to pay for doctors for them, but now he couldn't pay what he owed, so he was thrown into debtor's prison. His brother-in-law bailed him out, and John was able to pay off the rest of his debt, but he despaired of life. He refused to preach Universalism anymore, and in 1770, at the age of 29, he decided to leave behind the suffering of the old world and start life anew in America. Now, his ship was headed to New York, but it ran aground off the coast of New Jersey. So the captain sent people ashore to find supplies. There, John Murray met an elderly farmer called Thomas Potter, and in talking, they discovered that they were both Universalists. Potter had built a chapel for such Universalists in the region as would pass through, so he asked Murray to preach in his chapel that Sunday morning. Murray refused, saying that the ship would leave as soon as the wind changed, but Potter did not give up. He convinced Murray to promise that if the wind had not changed by Sunday, then he would preach as requested. The days passed, but the wind did not change. And so John Murray preached universal salvation in Thomas Potter's chapel on September 30th, 1770. And then the wind changed. A miracle. The ship took Murray to New York, and from there he became a traveling preacher along the mid-Atlantic. There were some Universalist communities in New Jersey and Pennsylvania that welcomed him, but mostly Murray preached a more general Christian message to avoid being thrown out of town. And that might have been the end of the story of both Murray and Universalism in America, but you'll have to wait a few minutes to find out what happened next. Judith Sargent was the most prominent woman essayist of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and arguably the first American feminist. She was the oldest child of the Sargent Saunders family of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and thanks to the family's wealth from trade, they were both influential and educated. Though Judith wasn't allowed to study alongside her brother, she had access to the family library, and in her words, seized by avidity everything she could read. She was also an avid writer, encouraged by her father's pride in what she later called her humble attempts at poetry. The Sargent family attended the established Congregational First Parish Church in Gloucester, but in 1770, Judith's father read a Universalist book he'd received from London. He began to gather friends and family in his home to discuss Universalism, And in 1774, they heard of a Universalist from England who was preaching along the East Coast. This was John Murray, of course, and Judith's father invited him to come to Gloucester to preach. Now, by this time, Judith was 5 years married to another John, the merchant John Stevens, but he doesn't seem to figure much in Judith's story. Rather, as soon as she met John Murray, Judith knew that she had found a mentor, a spiritual teacher, and an intellectual companion. In 1778, Judith Stevens and other Universalists were suspended from First Parish for not attending the church. We don't do that anymore. The following year, Judith and the others created their own independent congregation, building their own meeting house and calling John Murray as their minister. Then they refused to pay their parish taxes, and a lengthy legal battle with First Parish followed. Finally, in 1786, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Universalists. It was the first court ruling for religious freedom in America. Now, John Murray's name was on the case, but it was Judith Stevens and the others who fought for their rights. Indeed, when Murray was threatened with expulsion from Gloucester as a vagrant, it was the power and influence of the Sargent family that protected him. And when Judith and John Stevens adopted 2 orphan girls, it was Judith's concern for their religious upbringing and for that of the growing number of Universalist children in Gloucester that made Judith become a religious educator. Encouraged by her fellow parents, she even published a textbook based on what she was teaching, which was the first religious education materials for Universalists. In short, without the support of the Sargent family, and Judith Stevens in particular, John Murray would not have been able to work on an idea that he'd had for an association of Universalist churches. He'd spent a number of years talking with colleagues across New England, and in 1790 visited Philadelphia for what was called the Convention of the Universal Church. 3 years later, Murray was approved to form a similar organization in New England, which would in time become the Universalist Church of America, one of the 2 predecessors of today's Unitarian Universalist Association. By then, Judith and John Murray were married. The Revolutionary War had devastated John Stevens' business, and he left Gloucester to avoid debtor's prison, dying soon after in the West Indies. 2 years later, John Murray admitted his love for the widow Judith, and they were married in 1788. Now, Judith was a celebrated literary figure, thanks to her many essays, poems, and plays on topics such as education, marriage, parenting, religion, politics, and women's rights. So she opened some doors for John that had previously been closed to him. And she promoted both Universalism and her husband's career. Judith's most famous essay was published in 1790, titled On the Equality of the Sexes, and was the first argument for women's equality in Western literature. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women was published 1 year later. And in 1794, John became minister at Boston's first Universalist society. This was a large urban church, unusual amongst the otherwise mostly rural Universalists, and that made it a prestigious place for him to be the public face of Universalism for the rest of his life. John Murray is honored today as the founder of American Universalism, given his role in establishing it as a legitimate religious denomination with legal recognition. But the Sargent family, and Judith in particular, should also be recognized for making it possible for John to do that. Moreover, while so little of John's actual preaching survives, that as his biographers put it, it would be impossible to generate even a pamphlet made up of quotations, we have Judith's published works, as well as, thanks to their discovery in 1984, the volumes into which she transcribed all of her letters over more than 4 decades of regular correspondence with family and friends. In short, I think we owe more to Judith than to John. Without Judith and her family, John would have remained a traveling preacher, little more than a vagrant at constant risk of accusations of heresy. Thanks to Judith, there was religious freedom, the first Universalist church in America, the Universalist denomination, and today's Unitarian Universalism. I like to think of Judith and John Murray in terms of the stone cutters. They didn't write and preach as they did because it was an imposed obligation. Judith could have been a lady of leisure, and John could certainly have taken the safer path of preaching a Christianity that was identical to his own in all but one point of theology. And they didn't just write and preach, much less form the first Universalist church in America and create what would become the Universalist Church of America merely for the sake of income. Rather, the Murrays were building a cathedral of universal salvation, of religious freedom and gender equality, of good news and hope for all. Now, even by the beginning of the 19th century, Universalist theology was evolving beyond Judith's writing and John's preaching. And certainly today's Unitarian Universalism is beyond anything they could have imagined. But I am sure they would have been delighted to know that just a few decades later, it was the Universalist denomination that ordained the first woman as a minister. I'm going to ask you some wondering questions now, and I'll give you a little time after each to reflect. Pam will also put each question on the screen as I ask it. I wonder what you bring into this space of hope and community. I wonder what you have learned from the story of John Murray. I wonder what you have learned from the story of Judith Sargent Murray. I wonder how you envision the cathedral that we are building. For our activity today, we're going to meditate on a reading entitled One Love. It was written by the late Hope Johnson, who in 2006 received with her twin sister, Dr. Janice Marie Johnson, the UUA President's Award for Volunteer Service for all that they had done for Unitarian Universalism. As I read One Love, I invite you to meditate on Johnson's words as a vision of the cathedral that we are building, a cathedral that some would call the beloved community. You may wish to close your eyes to better envision what she is describing. We are one, a diverse group of proudly kindred spirits, here not by coincidence, but because we choose to journey together. We are active and proactive. We care deeply. We live our love as best we can. We are one, working, eating, laughing, playing, singing, storytelling, sharing and rejoicing, getting to know each other, taking risks, opening up, questioning, seeking, searching, trying to understand, struggling, making mistakes, paying attention, asking questions, listening, living our answers, learning to love our neighbors, learning to love ourselves, apologizing and forgiving with humility, and being forgiven through grace, creating the beloved community together. I invite you to take a silent moment to meditate on how we are creating the beloved community together. There's sometimes a sense in religious communities that all that matters is the present. And I'm not talking about mindfulness in the Buddhist sense. I'm talking about only thinking about the present, ignoring what has happened, ignoring the future. Now, it could be a sense of timelessness, that the way things are is the way they've always been and also the way they'll always be, in which case there's only the present. We don't do that intentionally as Unitarian Universalists, but sometimes we do cling to the way things are currently and resist change, but that's a whole topic for another Sunday. There's a more everyday way we can get trapped in the present, and that's because the things that happen every day can restrict our vision until we're only seeing what is right in front of us. What do we need to do to put together the next Sunday's service? What do we need to plan for music? What about putting together RE classes? What do parents expect us to help their children figure out? What about the workshops, classes, trainings, and other programs we offer on a regular basis? Those all need to be organized too. Many of them are on a monthly schedule, not to mention all of the committee and team meetings. And by the time the next month rolls around and we ask ourselves, didn't we just have that meeting? We realize a whole month has gone by and all we've had to focus on is what's been in front of us. It's enough to make us feel like that first stonecutter, who is part of something amazing but doesn't realize that because all he can do is gripe and complain about what he needs to get done at that moment. Or maybe we could be like the second stonecutter, because we're focused on what we're doing as a means to an immediate end. If the services and music and RE classes and workshops and even the meetings are only about satisfying the individual needs of members. But that's not building something that will endure the ravages of time. That's not growing something that will thrive and evolve and transform into something greater than we can ever imagine. Yes, we have to deal with what's right in front of us. Yes, we have to respond to needs and expectations. But from time to time, we must also look up and remember that we're building a cathedral that we call the beloved community. We didn't start building it, of course, and we won't finish building it any more than Judith and John Murray started or finished building it. What matters is that we are part of a proud lineage that includes 18th century Universalists in London, New Jersey, and Massachusetts, our spiritual forebears who believed in one love, fought for religious freedom, and cast a bold vision into the future. May we do likewise.